Hello everyone, and welcome to a video that provides some exploration of image aspect ratios. In this video we'll cover three topics: how to improve your use of aspect ratios, why photographers might want to use a specific aspect ratio or a different aspect ratio, and what common aspect ratios exist. And then I'll go over some photos that I've taken and talk about why I picked the aspect ratio that I picked for that image. With imaging, any aspect ratio can exist. Do you want to make an ultra-panoramic image that's 40 times wider than it is tall? You can do that. It's not going to be useful, but it is a thing that you can do. As always, drop me a comment with your thoughts about aspect ratios, any ideas you have about them, things I forgot to call out, and anything that I will have missed as well. So let's jump right into this video with ways that you can improve your use of aspect ratio, and I came up with 4 of them. The first one is experiment. Try new things with aspect ratios, with cropping your images or combining images, things like that, to see how it works and what works for you. The second one is break rules. That's an important one because you first have to learn the rules. Once you learn the rules, then you can break them and see what works that's outside of the established norms. The third one is take criticism. Give it thought. Accept it with a thank you, and then keep trying new things. And the fourth one is don't apologize for trying something new, and never listen to someone who tells you that it will never work. The sidewalk of the successful is paved with the backs of quitters. Let's answer the question that kicked off this video. Why use different aspect ratios? I have 8 reasons. As I name them each, I will share a sample photo or two that show it in use. The first is creative intent, as a complement to your subject, image story, or the scene. This is a general catch-all category that has to do with how you want to structure an image, how you want to use negative space, and how you want to visually tell the story within your image. The next is production medium. Throughout photography's history, image formats have been based on production medium. One of the earliest examples of this specifically was the postcard format. Cameras which took images that had negatives the same size as a postcard for contact printing negatives onto postcards while on vacation. As magazines became more popular, formats like 4x5 and 6x7, which had aspect ratios close to the print ratio, were popular as they maximized the negative use and also encouraged a great deal of portrait orientation photography, even in landscapes. And more recently, smartphones have brought back portrait-oriented images. Photography is, and always has been, adaptable to the changing viewing habits of people who consume image media. The third is subject complement or subject requirement. Some subjects just work better with extreme aspect ratios, and some work better in a square format. There's just no way around it. Sometimes one format works better than another for a specific subject. The fourth is creative challenge, and this is basically the challenge of using the wrong aspect ratio. I just said some subjects just work better with different aspect ratios. Well, try doing it the wrong way and see what happens. The fifth is composition exploration. This is a large category that basically means your aspect ratio in some way, shape, or form influences the meaning, message, or story of your image. As an example, here are 2 image pairs, same scene, but in one the scene is a landscape and in another it's a portrait. Note that the different aspect ratios emphasize sky in foreground or midground. As another example of this, if you were to think about different formats, images that have a more squat or closer to square but still rectangular format feel wider. So if you were to take an image at 1x1 and then crop the sky out until you got to something a bit more landscapey or wide angle or extreme in regards to aspect ratio, it would generally feel wider when you're at an aspect ratio that's about 1.25 to 1 than say 1.5 or 2 to 1, because there would be more sky in the taller image. The 6th reason is preferred image structure. Now, this is just a matter of personal preference and how you want to structure your photos, and there's no real right or wrong with this approach to using aspect ratios. The seventh is what I call too lazy to crop, and hey, guilty as charged. But sometimes too lazy to crop also means that what you did in the camera was already correct, and maybe that's a better way to say it. It's not that I was too lazy to crop, I just did it right the first time. The last one, number 8, is lens selection. Some lenses simply perform differently on different image sizes, and sometimes a lens that's only fair on one format could be stunning on another, and this is really a thing that has more to do with large format, say going from 8x10 to 4x10, which would be more of a squat format to a wider format. And that's a specific example where some lenses might work really well for wide angle use, but not be quite as captivating when you're using more of the image circle. Now, there is no set mandatory aspect ratio for any image, period, and end of story. Do you want to crop a digital photo to any size or shape you like? Please go for it. Do you want to cut a piece of film or photo paper to a panoramic aspect ratio that no one has ever used before? Or make a camera that shoots an obscenely long panorama on an entire roll of 35mm film? Yeah, do it. Do you want to stitch or merge digital images into some new shape or image aspect ratio? Well, that's strongly encouraged around here. Aspect ratios are whatever you want them to be. Now, that said, there are some that have been used over the years that are more successful than others, especially today. As a guide, I developed this table I'm showing now that shows the aspect ratios of common and uncommon image formats, and for even comparison, I reduced them all to something to 1. As you look at this table, note how the numbers group together, even across digital and film formats. Many of the same basic aspect ratios appear multiple times. There are simply some aspect ratios that are more useful than others, as this table shows. And if you doubt that, how many 1.5 to 1 or 1.3-ish to 1 formats are there? Yeah, that's a big number. But how many 22 to 1 formats? Exactly. There are aspect ratios that are very hard to use effectively for any purpose, such as print production, screen display, or, and this is the most important purpose, to tell your image's story. Now, lastly, let's take a look at some of my photos here, and these are going to align with the 8 reasons I identified to use different formats. For creative intent, I have 2 images here that are different aspect ratios. This first one is a lot of large black negative space, and it's the standard full frame aspect ratio. The second one here is I cropped the top and bottom off of this image to give it a slightly wider aspect ratio to tighten in on the subject, this guy who was smoking out front of this bar, and also to get rid of some distracting foreground and top of the image elements so that it would more be all of these vertical structures within this horizontal shape. So this was a very deliberate crop on my part. Regarding production medium of screen versus print, I will often use 4x5 image aspect ratios because I do a lot of my own, I print a lot of my own photos, and those tend to get printed on 16x20 canvases. So here's a film photo we're looking at first here. This was taken on 8x10, and this is a photo of an old mine, not, in Cripple Creek, in the Cripple Creek area here in Colorado. And this was, you can see here the film outline of the 8x10 negative carrier, so you know that this is the full sheet digitization of this image, okay? This was a very deliberate 8x10 format pick because I wanted to compose this with this aspect ratio so it'd be a little bit squatter, which means a little bit more room in the sky versus the same width as a shorter or wider angle aspect ratio. And this allowed me to have a little bit of negative space while also having the full height of this mine building in the image. A couple of other 4x5 examples include these portraits here that I took at Day of the Dead last year in Mexico, and I cropped these down, generally speaking, cropped these down to 4x5 so that we'd get a tighter portrait photo. 4x5 is an aspect ratio that works really well for portraits. A few of these I did leave in the standard full frame aspect ratio, however, because they showed a little bit more of the sky in one case and a little bit more of the costumes in the other. So this is an example where subservient to your production medium is telling the story correctly. The third example we talked about was subject complement. And here are a bunch of different aspect ratios that kind of show that as well as I can. There's some 1-to-1 in here, close to 1-to-1, a really tall and skinny photo, and all of these were deliberate aspect ratio choices, whether in camera or as I was editing them, so that I could capture the scene in the way that I wanted to. In this photograph of the Eta Aquariids over Twin Peaks down in southern Colorado, this was a very specific image that I planned out in 1-to-1 ahead of time. And I did that because I wanted to capture the mountain and the foreground and also a bunch of the different meteors that were burning up in the atmosphere and the Milky Way. And I knew that I wanted to structure this as a square image so that I could have all of these different horizontal layers: the foreground, the mountain, the Milky Way, and then the sky, the meteors coming into the atmosphere. So I thought of this not just as a square image, but as a bunch of different horizontal layers comprising it. This next one we'll talk about is a street food vendor who was cooking some food at, I forget exactly where I was for this photo. And I just really liked having this square image because it cropped out the stuff on the sides that was like the crowd on the right side and like a part of the food cart on the left side. And this is an image where the aspect ratio was used to focus the attention of the viewer specifically on the action without any distracting elements on the sides of the image. This next shot here is of the interior of a church in Helsinki, and I specifically picked portrait orientation with the standard full-frame aspect ratio for this because it allowed me to capture a nice foreground with leading lines going up to the pipe organ, and also to capture some of the horizontal structure on the sides of the pipe organ to work as a boundary to the image. And all of this works. This is more than just aspect ratio going on here, by the way. There's a lot of other image structure elements that are designed to keep the viewer's eyes in the center of the image at the pipe organ and the structures leading up to it. And the last image from this group that we're going to talk about specifically is this nighttime photo of Rifle Falls. And this was a photo I specifically set out to make a tall and skinny photo because when I planned this photo before I took it, I wanted to take a photo of the falls in approximately the middle of the frame with the creek that comes out of them leading toward the image and then the sky above it. So this is another example where when I planned this, I thought of this tall, skinny photo in 3 different distinct parts: the sky, the falls, and the creek, and then just arranged them in a tall and skinny photo to use that aspect ratio to emphasize the amount of distance that was captured with this wide-angle lens. This was the 20mm Viltrox, and also the overall structure of the scene. The fourth reason I had identified was for a creative challenge, and these are some different photos I took to try to meet that goal. How could I photograph windmills in portrait versus landscape orientation? How could I structure a spiral staircase, which really, a spiral staircase is more kind of a squarish type thing if you think of the way that the circle repeats on itself. But how could I structure that within a longer aspect ratio so that I could find a way to structure it that would be visually interesting within the confines of that aspect ratio? And then the last one is this picture of the roof of the library in Helsinki. And I really like the idea of trying to capture, if this had been a square image, if you can imagine it being a square image where the corners coming away from that central circle meet the corners of the image, it would be a completely different photo. And so using it as a wider image showed a little bit more of the surrounding roof and a little bit more of the structure and made this in my mind anyway, when I visualized it, a slightly more interesting composition. The fifth reason we talked about with aspect ratios was composition exploration. And we're going to revisit some of these photos I took where I took them both in horizontal landscape and portrait orientation of the same subject. So you can kind of see how they change. And for me, I think that the pair that really shows this the best is the boat under the Milky Way. Because if we look at the portrait orientation photo of this, what we see is we have a whole lot more image interest. We get more of the Milky Way. We lose some of the background shoreline, but that's not important. And we also get more of the reflection in the water from the boat's lights. It's just a much more dynamic photo than the landscape orientation version, which shows more shoreline and more empty sky. So the deliberate choice in the different use of image orientation specifically for this is the different use of composition within the frame. Now, if you could extend this out, by the way, to what would these look like as square format images, or what would they look like wider or more squat, for instance. So image aspect ratio complements your image orientation. The sixth reason that I identified was image structure. And I have one example for this. Probably could have come up with more, but we're going to take a look at this picture of this old church here that was in a museum, an outdoor museum in Helsinki. And this one, I really liked the way that the forest path led up to this. So I want you to imagine this in a square format, cutting off the bottom of the image. And if you can imagine that, we lose a whole lot of what's in that foreground, which is this funneling leading line shape up to the church. And realistically, I guess if you imagine this being an even taller, skinnier image, that you could see some more of the sky and the tree and some more of the foreground path in front of it. And that could make it an even more captivating image. But with that aspect ratio, the church would be a smaller amount of the image. And so it would lose some of its importance to the overall image. So one thing to think about with aspect ratio is also the amount of image real estate that's used with the different elements within the photo. How much of a percentage of the photo is the path? The percentage of the photo is the church, or the dark space around it, which is really just negative space. So those are some other things to think about when you think about how you're going to structure an image with your aspect ratio. And if you break it into zones or percentages or something like that, what aspect ratio now maximizes the use of your image elements as percentages of the total image space. And if you think back to the waterfall and the Edda Aquariids photos that we looked at, the same concept is going on there. The seventh reason I identified was just being lazy, and all of these photos are ones that got no cropping. I set them up in camera. They didn't need to be cropped, and all of these just came out fine. They didn't need to be adjusted for orientation, or they weren't slightly cockeyed or anything. This is just how they were coming out of the camera. And so if you do your job correctly in the camera when it comes to composing your image, you don't have to worry about cropping. You can maximize your sensor or film space and get an image that tells your story effectively right off of the bat. And that's a really good thing to learn to do. In fact, there was a school of photography, I forget what it was called, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where photographers would contact print their photos with the sheet film frame visible. As we saw in one of the earlier photos, the frame of the negative was visible in that, and you could see the shape of the film around the image. That stems from that early school of photography where the photographers were kind of showing off to say that I don't need to crop my images. I am so good at composing in camera that I'm going to prove that this image is the full negative by printing it with the negative frame. And so if you do it right in camera, you save yourself a whole bunch of time, and you also can kind of show off a little bit. I'm not above that sometimes. And the last one is lens selection. Now, here are 3 different images taken on different lenses. 2 of them were taken on the 20mm Sony APS-C lens on full frame. Those are the 2 architecture photos. And then the third one was taken with a telephoto lens, I forget which one, on a speed booster on the Sony full frame. And so if you use a lens that clips the corners slightly because you're shooting GFX with a full frame lens, or APS-C lenses on full frame, something like that, you might want to crop down to a 4:5 aspect ratio to lose some of that corner darkness. That's what I did with the photo of the old opera building in Bilbao with the lamp on the left side, by the way. You can see that I don't have dark image corners in here because I cropped the image down to 4:5. And same with the photo of looking up at the fountain in Bilbao as well. But I left the dark corners in this photo of the elk so that you can see, you can kind of visualize, this is what the full frame image looked like with the speed booster. If you imagine cropping this down to 4:5 so that the corners, especially those on the left where they're more severe, are removed, now you just have a slightly tighter image of the elk and you don't have that darkness. So lens selection and the way that you use your camera can influence the way that you crop your photo and the aspect ratio you use to tell your story with it. And with that, that is everything I had for this video. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in whatever comes next.